This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Well, welcome everyone. My name is Halle Institute, and I'm Emory's Vice Provost for International Affairs, and I also have the pleasure of directing the Halle Institute for Global Learning. Many of you may know that the Halle Institute is Emory's premier venue for bringing heads of state, distinguished public intellectuals, and policymakers into dialogue with the Emory and Atlanta community. And today I'm very pleased that we're hosting our distinguished guest along with a number of other very prominent institutions at Emory, or centers and institutions and departments, including, and I'd like the directors and representatives of those institutions to just raise their hands so members of our audience know who's here. The Confucius Institute in Atlanta, which is based at Emory, Sai Rong, the director. The Carter Center and the Carter Center China program, John Hardman, Yawei here. Also, the India, China, and America Institute, led by Jag Sheth, a professor of marketing in the business school. The East Asian Studies program, the Department of Political Science, the Russian, East Asian, and Languages and Cultures program, RIALC, and Alpha Kappa Psi, the Honors Society for the Business School. So I want to thank you all for co-sponsoring this event, and I'd like to introduce the person who's going to introduce our speaker, and that is because were it not for Mary Brown Bullock, we would not have our guest here today, and she's been wonderful in helping us to bring David Michael Lampton to campus. And I'd like to just say a few words about Mary because it hasn't been too long that she's been here at Emory as a distinguished professor of China Studies. She, prior to that, was president of Agnes Scott College, as many of you know, which is nearby and a wonderful liberal arts college for women. She joined the Asia Foundation's Board of Trustees in 2006 and became president emeritus at Agnes Scott in the summer of 2006 after 11 years as president. She became a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in fall 2006 and joined the faculty of Emory as a visiting distinguished professor of China Studies in fall 2007. She has a very distinguished bio, and I will refer you to her webpage in the political science department, and she will introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly, and I want to thank also all the sponsors of this lecture and really the range of different institutions and people that are interested in China and Asia here at Emory. So I'm glad this occasion could bring people together. I want to also welcome members of my class, History Political Science 485. Why don't you wave your hands there? Right, yes. And there's a sign-in sheet for you outside the table. It really is my pleasure to introduce David Michael Lampton. You will find quickly that most people call him Mike, and that he asks people to call him Mike Lampton. Mike is certainly the country's leading scholar and practitioner of U.S.-China relations. I know of no one whose career has been able to combine both significant scholarship. Mike, I think I counted 9 books on your resume. There may be more than I didn't count. Significant scholarship along with public leadership in policy areas and public programs on U.S.-China relations over really his entire career. I do claim a slight pride in that I hired Mike in his first Washington, D.C. job, actually to take my place when I was on a sabbatical at the National Academy of Science. And from then on, I think he was hooked on policy issues and trying to bring together the world of scholarship and the world of public policy. Mike served as president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. We were talking about it from 1988 till 1997. And I think my students could all tell you those were very difficult years in U.S.-China relations. And the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations is really the public organization that tries to address issues in the relationship, bring distinguished Chinese and American policymakers, but also teachers and others together to try to address those kind of issues. So he was really in the hot seat during those years. I think one of the great things that came out of that period is actually your book. And the book title is called Same Bed, Different Dreams. Isn't it just a perfect kind of title for U.S.-China relations even till today. And that book really draws on Mike's experience leading this national NGO during difficult times, but also the scholarship of the policy making. He has written widely in the field of China's foreign policy. His most recent book, and I'm sorry that my copy is on reserve in the library, I've assigned it to both classes this year, is called Three Faces of Chinese Power: Money, Might, and Minds. I have found it was published last year. It's, I think, receiving a widespread acclaim. I have found it really one of the best conceptual ways to look at what China's power means today through these three kinds of power that Mike talks about, and I'm sure he will be talking with us today. He is a Stanford PhD, and he has also served as a policy director of China Studies at the Nixon Institute and in several other Washington think tanks. Today his position is he's the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies, Director of China Studies Program at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And he has been Dean of the Faculty, or just stepped down? Are you still Dean of the Faculty? Still Dean of the Faculty at SAIS. So please, which he told me at lunch, ranks either number 1 or number 2 of all the U.S. schools of international studies. So with that, Mike, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Mary, and I want to thank Dr. We okay here? Dr. Semetko as well for the warm hospitality and the gracious introduction. And I do want to thank all of the co-sponsoring institutions, particularly want to note the Carter Center because it fundamentally changed the life opportunities of all of us who study China, and I think changed the trajectory of the United States and Asia and so on. So I have nothing but the greatest admiration for what President Carter did, both as president and certainly in the years after he's been president, and so I should make that clear. I also want to acknowledge that a number of things about Mary, Professor Bullock, that you may not all know. She played a major role in the chief academic organization in the United States. It was housed in the National Academy of Sciences. You were there in the 80s, and did it get into the 70s and 80s? And it played the major role in establishing academic contact across a broad range of natural science and social science fields. And among the many programs they put on was a group on steroid chemistry. I will say birth control pills was the primary interest the Chinese had at that particular time. And they asked a young political scientist out at Ohio State if he might want to accompany that group of scientists. I'd worked on public health and medicine in China. And long and the short of it is, the most impressive thing wasn't that you asked me. It was, and I think it was emblematic of the time and the difficulty of dealing with China. The Chinese accepted all the hard scientists and said they really didn't need a political scientist and X'd me off the list. And much to the credit, I will say, of the Academy of Sciences and Mary's organization and the scientists that were involved in that, all agreed that they wouldn't go unless I went. And that was my first trip to China. Turned out to be in 1976. Mao Zedong had just died. We, I believe, were the first American group to actually enter China after Mao's death. So it turned to be out to me to just be, well, it just launched me, as you indicated, in a whole new direction in my career. So I want to eternally thanks, but more to the point, the United States owes Mary and the organization and the scholars at that time, I think, a great debt of gratitude, because one of the first things President Carter did when he sent Frank Press, the head of the Academy of Sciences, to China was to between our countries. I think it was a wise move, and we didn't do it what we did with the Soviet Union in these scholarly exchanges. I think that was wise as well. I just one other prefatory remark before I get to the topic. Many of you, well, of course, this is the Goizeta Business School, and Roberto Goizeta has personal meaning to me, beyond the fact that he led an iconic American company, Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola was really a path breaker into China commercially, and Mr. Goizeta led that drive. I was just looking up his biographic material. Quite admirable man. Apparently hit the American shores with $40 and 100 shares of Coke stock. That's at least what Wikipedia says, and I'm entirely prepared to believe that. But in any case, he had a remarkable vision, and I remember we brought 6 mayors from China to the United States, and Coca-Cola had a presentation to them. And I was so struck by the essence of the Coke model was to involve local authorities and local entrepreneurs in this global company, but there were interests that were made quite clear for the locality and local input and sourcing, and it brought a lot of modern management to China. And I just remember all 6 of those mayors from different cities of China, after that presentation, wanted a Coke plant in their bottling company, and their Coke's been remarkably successful there. But I think more than just the success, I admired the strategic view he had, and also that he put Coke in almost a diplomatic posture and a development posture, not just a money-making enterprise, although it was certainly that as well. What I'd like to do today is talk about China, how we might think about Chinese power, and what that power might mean for the United States. And I want just a few prefatory remarks about the era we're in and the context for what I really want to say. I think that this month is really a remarkable month in the history of post-World War II, well, certainly United States, but probably the post-World War II global economy. I think you could probably put it this way, that the U.S. has moved from the G7 world, if you actually think that's where we were, to something more embraced by what you would call the G20 world. Meaning that there are a lot more actors that are central to our future in the period going ahead than I think we perceive. That is to say, I think the United States, while it's certainly an important country, the country I love, in fact, we are becoming one of many important actors in the world, and that has lots of, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for a Secretary of State, for instance, to say we are the indispensable country. I know what stands behind that statement emotionally, and I'm not trying to be provocative, but I think we're going to have to learn that there are other important actors, and the question is, how can we influence them? How can we understand their motivations? How can we appeal to their interests as well as their higher angels? But our capacity to coerce the world is, I think, going to diminish in substantial. It means we're really going to have to increase our empathy for other people. And by empathy, I don't mean sympathy. I mean capacity to put yourself in the other person's or the other country's shoes, not because you agree with them, not because you've necessarily adopted their values, but because if you're going to be effective with them, you have to understand where they're coming from, and certainly your proposals have to bear some resemblance to some reasonable facsimile of their interests. I think also we've got to become much smarter in how we're making decisions, much more responsive, and it has implications for just how we make policy in the world. So I take this to all be exciting. I don't take this all to be a big problem, but I think the world is changing before our eyes and what it means for our own power. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to study Chinese power. Of course, I've spent my whole life looking at China, but the meaning of looking to China in this particular project was it really put a mirror up in front of us where, by thinking about how the Chinese think about power, it in fact provided an opportunity for us to think about how we might think about our own national power and what its limitations and strengths may be. As Mary mentioned, I just did this book called The Three Faces of Chinese Power: Might, Money, and Minds. And the might, money, and minds are really sort of the rhyming version of the work of a sociologist, a man named Amitai Etzioni, who I read way back at Stanford as actually in Bill Skinner's anthropology class. Amitai Etzioni talked about three kinds of power. Essentially the power to coerce, the power to bribe, and the power to persuade intellectually and spiritually. And that sort of trichotomy always struck me as a very useful way to look at power. And I wanted to ask the simple question, how have the Chinese looked at power since 500 BC? I don't spend too much time pre-1978, but the Chinese have a long history of thinking about power domestically and with respect to dealing with others. And I wanted to look at changes in Chinese power in each of these three dimensions. And then I wanted to ask, does China have a strategy to acquire power and to use it? And then I wanted to end the book by asking, well, if I've made these observations, what does it mean for American policy? And indeed, I would say the outside world's policy towards China. It was one of the funnest projects I've ever done. I've enjoyed all my projects, but this I really became engaged in. It provided me the opportunity to travel around the periphery of China. I'd never been to Vietnam prior to this project. Got an opportunity to talk to the Vietnamese about how they might understand Chinese power and what it meant for them. Australia, I'd never been to Australia. Got a chance to go there. Went to Singapore, Korea, Japan, Russia at one point, talking about not only how does a Westerner look at this, but how do China's neighbors, the people living up close to China, view all of this. Now, before I sort of talk a little about some of what I think are the central ideas and conclusions to which I came, I thought I might try, this is an interesting time to be talking about Chinese power and set a couple of contexts. I think, first of all, in the last few months, there have been some interesting developments both in China and with respect to US-China relations, China's role in the world, and I just wanted to kind of, I think these are tangible expressions of some of the abstract ideas that I talk about in the book. First of all, in February, we had the trip of Secretary Clinton to China. And I must say, I think the Chinese were a bit apprehensive. I'll speak candidly. I think they were a little apprehensive about her visit. The last time she'd gone in an official role really was in 1995 at the 4th UN Women's Conference. She'd delivered a pretty, I would think it's fair to say from a Chinese point of view, harsh message to the Chinese. They weren't sure what the message might be this particular time. I think from my discussions with at least some Chinese, including in the foreign ministry, they were very happy with Secretary Clinton's visit. In fact, she did what Americans often don't, and I think is a problem. She specified what the priorities of the United States really are. You can disagree, and indeed she came back to some disagreement, but she said we've got economic and security problems. We're not going to let human rights issues and so forth interfere with the priorities, those priorities, although we continue to care about those issues, but we're going to put them in different zones. I think that was, you can like it or not like it, but I think that was a takeaway that the Chinese had, and to some extent they think they can deal with that. I think another major thing was certainly earlier this month, President Obama met with President Hu Jintao. By all accounts, their meetings went pretty well. We've agreed on a framework of dialogue between the United States and China, and I think that meeting went well. There had been a call even before that, shortly after Obama became president, and that went well. It was interesting. President Obama said, and I wonder what our European allies, the Japanese, thought when they heard this, that this is the most important bilateral relationship the United States has. That, I think, is just one indication of that you would have an American president say that so early, so clearly, so publicly to not only the Chinese but the rest of the world. Another interesting thing I just want to call your attention to are the remarks earlier this month by the People's Bank of China governor, a man named Zhou Xiaochuan. He talked about the renminbi, the Chinese currency, but not only that, he talked about maybe the US dollar shouldn't be the sole standard of international exchange in the future. when you start talking about a world where the dollar isn't central, you're beginning to talk about fundamental change in the world. I don't think China wants to push that rapidly, but just the fact that it would be brought up publicly at this particular moment, I think is a straw in the wind. And also earlier this month, you'll remember we had a confrontation, if that's quite the right word, between the U.S. Navy and some vessels from China in the South China Sea. So it's all by way of saying, I think you can just see in the last 45 days, China is impinging on us in the security domain, in the economic domain, that its relationship to the United States is certainly salient in the eyes of this administration. I'm not going to talk more about U.S.-China relations so directly because I'll talk about that tomorrow, but the context for my remarks really is I think a startling sort of set of manifestations in the last 45 days about the increasing importance of China to the United States and management of the problems that we're all facing. A second context, and particularly relevant to the Carter Center, of course, this is the 30th anniversary year of the normalization of U.S.-China relations. I guess the announcements all took place on December 15th, 1978, but taking effect on the 1st. And I think it's fair to say that certainly when President Nixon went to China in 1972, and my understanding of President Carter's thinking had a lot to do with the Soviet Union and the need to put pressure on the Soviet Union in the context of the Cold War. I think President Carter had a sense also of economic relations in a broader sense, frankly, than Nixon did. But what is so striking is 30 years ago, a central piece of the rationale for dealing with China. And if you fast forward now and you say, what's the rationale for U.S.-China relations? I think in some sense it's much stronger than it's ever been, perhaps ever in history, but certainly since 1949. If you were to ask what's the rationale for U.S.-China relations now, it's economic stabilization of the global economy, it's ecological stabilization, global warming, that set of issues, and what you might call security stabilization, including non-proliferation and that set of issues. So, and we just see North Korea, and now the United States wants North Korea to do more to rein in the Chinese to do more to rein in the North Koreans. So it's interesting that in these last 30 years we've moved from a rather narrow security rationale for relations to, I would say, a much more balanced and broad-based rationale. And the key word stabilization. Stabilization of the economy, stabilization of security, stabilization of the ecological system, broadly speaking. I think that's a much more sound basis for a long-term durable relationship with China. The third and last sort of prefatory context I want to create here is when I talk about this whole discussion is about Chinese power. And it's sort of easy to conclude from listening, to a half hour or so about Chinese power that I think China's some atlas bestriding the world, sort of with the potential to grind all under its heel. In fact, as I try to tell my students, you should thank every day you don't wake up and find yourself a Chinese leader, given the agenda that they're facing. That is to say that I think China's leaders, while we can talk a lot about their role in the world, they're proud of it, they've got to deal with the world, they find advantage in doing so, they are very much preoccupied with their domestic agenda. And I just want to remind you of all of the things that the Chinese leaders have to worry about beyond us. I know my own students are very worried about jobs. And of course, I think in the current recession now, we say we've lost about, 5 million to 6 million jobs. Next year, the Chinese have to find employment for at least 40 million people. That's a little ambiguity. It might be 45 million, it might be 38 million. But they've got to find on the order of 40 million jobs next year just to sort of stay at the same place on the treadmill that they are. If you look at one of my favorite economists in China is a man named Huan Gong. And he talks about the four Chinas. We all often think about Pudong or Shanghai or coastal skyscrapers and so on, but 50% of China's population is still living at the per capita GNP level of China's or the world's poorest people. If you think about natural disasters, China is still very vulnerable to natural disasters. 1998, you had big floods on the Yangtze River. In 2008, you had the Wenchuan earthquake and so forth. So this is still a society. I was in China with my brother in January, a little more than a year ago, and China was substantially shut down by snow and ice storms and a collapsing electrical power system and so forth. So you're still talking about a society that, while we're sort of focused on the dynamic eastern seaboard, that is still very substantially dependent on nature and its vagaries. And I think also what makes this current economic downturn so disturbing for the Chinese is that it's really the first major economic downturn, really major, certainly since 1989. So they are the first economic downturn with a substantial middle class that they've been building, where they have to face economic deprivation of some magnitude, unemployment. And so how the leadership's going to be able to manage this is a bit of a problem. So that's all a sort of long-winded way of saying China's leaders have their problems. And they're not spending all of their time thinking about the international system, and they're not spending all their time thinking about us. Now, I thought what I'd do is just talk a little bit about power and how I conceptualize it, what I think is most useful to think about it in terms of China, give you a few summary conclusions about what I think about Chinese power in these various domains, and then say what I think the implications are and open it up for questions. I suppose the first thing to think about is, what is power? And that's not, if you read the political science literature in general, you will become more confused the more you read, because there are multiple definitions. But the one in all of this that I read that I liked and modified a bit was by Joseph Nye. And he basically said power is the capacity to achieve your objectives. And all I would add to that is power is the capacity to define and achieve your objectives. Meaning, I think in modern political systems, maybe most social systems, a real problem is not achieving your objectives, it's often defining what objective you want. So I define power as the capacity to define and achieve your objectives with the least expenditure of resources, sort of an economist's end to that definition. I think my bottom line conclusion is, and it was not one I started my career in bureaucratic politics. And if you look at bureaucracies for very long, you find it's kind of difficult to define objectives and then sort of systematically, much less efficiently, achieve them. I assumed that I wasn't going to be too impressed with the capacity of the Chinese to define and achieve their objectives. I must say that looking back from over the 30 years, one has to be pretty impressed, particularly with the strategic vision of Deng Xiaoping, and the very sort of systematic way in which they've marshaled what were initially very limited resources to achieve those objectives, and when objectives needed modification, were able to mid-course correct along the way. Now, I don't want to make this seem more sort of rational actor, perfectly calculated out, but in retrospect, there was and there is a vision in China that's widely shared, not only in elites, but I think among the Chinese people and their leadership. And so I actually came away from this research with a conclusion I wasn't predisposed to have, which is there is a strategy. It is definable. The Chinese, for the most part, broadly speaking, know what it is, and with some efficiency have marched in that direction. So the whole first chapter sort of deals with this. Is there a national strategy? What is it? What is the goal? How efficiently have Chinese moved towards it? How have they modified that strategy over time, and so forth. The next three chapters deal with each of the kinds of power that I'm interested in. Might, That's coercive power, the capacity to threaten. And I put it first not because I think that's the most important part of the Chinese strategy. Frankly, I think the Chinese strategy is on the money and the minds, not the might. But I put, anyway, the might chapter first because most Americans, I think, when they have concerns about China, think in that direction. And what struck me about the acquisition of coercive power in China is that in the first part of the strategy, it was not a major component. For the first, up until 1990, from 78 to 1990, China's military budget often fell absolutely in terms of renminbi fell. It fell continually as a percentage of GDP. It was really with only 1989, in 1990, China began what has now been, since 1990, double-digit growth in military budget every year except one. So initially, Deng Xiaoping's vision really was, we're going to de-emphasize the military, shrink it from 4 million down to what is now about 2.3 million, headed to 2 million, and we're going to do two things. We're going to upgrade the quality of what remains of the People's Liberation Army in terms of training. But the key was we're going to develop our domestic economy so we have the basis for a modern military system, educated people, and so forth to staff a modern military. And so at the first part of the strategy, the military was really the third or fourth priority in China. And this day that China's capacity to project power very far from its shores is pretty limited. Now, we may all recall a little more than a year ago, the Chinese shot a satellite out of the air, so you have to go sort of systems by system and capability by capability. The Chinese certainly have more power projection capability than they've ever had, but in relative terms, most of the I've been to China with about 11 four-star military officers over time, and almost every one of them said, you know, China at the end of the 1990s into the 2000s was further behind where the U.S. was technologically than it was at the beginning of the decade. So you have to keep two things in mind. The Chinese are progressing, but the rest of the world, and particularly the United States, is as well. I think what is most interesting about how the Chinese think about their military power, though, isn't simply what they're doing to get more of it. It is that they recognize the Soviet Union made a big mistake with its military power. That by overinvesting in the military, the Soviets underinvested in their domestic economy, eroded the basis of political support that people had for the Soviet regime. And not only that, in the process of acquiring all this coercive power, organized the rest of the world, or a good chunk of the rest of the world, against them. And I think the Chinese, in the collapse of the Soviet Union, learned a lesson, and that is don't overinvest in the military to the cost of your domestic economy and legitimacy among your people. And secondly, don't have a military policy that builds an international coalition against you that simply requires you to spend more money and you end up further weakening yourself domestically. There are some wonderful studies the Chinese have done on the implications of the fall of the Soviet Union for their own policy. They've been very systematic thinking about that, and it's much in the vein that I've just described. And the other thing that I think they've done that's very intelligent, relatively speaking, in the military domain is, as Secretary Perry, he often likes to say, I've been involved in a project with him for a number of years. He says, you know, military is a lot more than weapons. A military can also be a diplomatic instrument, an instrument of reassurance. That is to say, take when you had the tsunami, and American carriers are going out and helicopters are rescuing people and so on. Militaries can have reassuring purposes as well as coercive. And what's interesting is the Chinese are beginning to try to use their military in more reassuring ways. China's boosting the number of peacekeepers around the world, has peacekeepers in Haiti, has them in Sudan. Now there's a lot that could be said. I don't want to exaggerate it. Also, when the tsunami happened, for the first time, the PLA sent, I think it was around 5 medical people. They were afraid to have too many people go down to Southeast Asia all at once from the Chinese military. But they're trying to, I think, use the military in a more reassuring way. So at the same time that we consider China acquiring more modern weapon systems and so on, I think it's at least worth looking at the other ways they're trying to use this instrumentality that are somewhat more reassuring. Now, when all is said and done, as I'll mention, China's neighbors aren't entirely reassured nonetheless. As you keep building your military and acquiring capabilities, it's one thing to say they haven't caught up with the U.S., but if you're the Vietnamese or the Mongolians or the Indians, your perspective would be different than that of the United States. So I'm not trying to create a rosy picture, but I think the Chinese are thinking in very sophisticated terms about how they can increase their military power without, let's put it this way, creating the minimal number of negative problems that arise from trying to do that. On the money side, of course, most Americans when they think about Chinese economic power, they think about made in China, they think about China's exports, and I think that's all, of course, something worthy of thought, and the book does deal with that. But I think the interesting point isn't so much that China's a seller, exporter. It calls for comment, but the interesting thing is that China increasingly is becoming a buyer. And my dad used to be a small business person, and he said, you know, Mike, if you don't remember anything about customers, remember this. The customer is always right. That means the customer has influence. And the fact of the matter is that China is becoming almost the biggest customer for everybody in Asia. China is the biggest customer, meaning importer, from Japan, from South Korea, most Southeast Asian countries. And of course, much of what they're buying is assembled and then exported to the United States or Europe or Japan, so it's a complicated system. But put it this way, if you just look at bilateral trade statistics, you're going to find China's the biggest buyer or the second biggest buyer for increasing numbers of countries, in particular our allies. And all I would say is that we are in a world in which everybody wants exports. Everybody wants high-paying export jobs, and so we're all competing for exports. And China, while it has a big trade surplus, is the most rapidly growing importer for lots of countries, including the United States, for a long time. And so while we're all focused on China's trade surplus, I think the interesting thing is twofold. Is its buyer of imports, and it's also amassed all this foreign exchange that it's now investing in the world and buying assets, whether it's resources or productive facilities or technology. And you are seeing increasing numbers of countries that want investment competing for the attentions of China. You're already seeing, and you will see as this economic downturn goes on, more and more governors and even the federal government, I think, regretting sort of the rough treatment maybe on Unicap, because we sent the message we didn't want Chinese investment. Well, it looks a little different now than it did a couple of years back. So I spent a lot of time talking about, certainly Chinese exports, because that's important, but I spend much more time talking about the increasing influence China has by virtue of its capacity to buy. And, particularly you start to look at cases like aircraft purchases. It was at least about 2 years ago, about 1 out of every 6 Boeing aircraft rolling off the assembly lines went to China. And those are, 100 million at a pop kind of purchases. And Airbus is the other big manufacturer there. And you find national governments aligning themselves with their big high-value exporting countries to try to gain influence. China's had a lot of success playing off aircraft and nuclear power companies that have very large investments like Westinghouse and GE on nuclear power plants and so forth. So whole zone of competition in terms of China as a buyer. Now, the most interesting form of power to me was the third, that is mines. I think, to sort of give you a bottom line conclusion, I think China has the potential to be much more innovative than most Americans, I think, assume. I think we assume it's a communist country, it's got a bunch of gray bureaucrats, too rigid a structure, doesn't encourage free thinking, censors the press, all the kind of things you don't associate with a highly innovative society. And of course, I think obviously much of that actually is true. But what is impressing me is how much the Chinese are beginning to try, within some of those constraints, create a more innovative society. I'll just give you could start with Frank Press in 1978 and bringing over what has been for decades 60,000 students and scholars a year to the United States. I went to the Johns Hopkins graduation not too long ago. And when you got to the PhDs in nanotechnology and biotechnology and solid state physics and all of this, if you didn't have a Korean, Chinese, or Indian surname, there was a 50-50 chance you weren't there at that graduation. And I don't know the nationality of all of the people as opposed to their ethnicity, but the long and the short of it is our best high technology programs have substantial Chinese populations. That would be one manifestation. But the Chinese are now sending large numbers of scholars abroad for short periods of training, rather as they did when they sort of began this. Everybody I know is awash in requests from Chinese scholars from the best universities to come and spend a year essentially on sabbatical. Certainly an indication of that. China is now trying to almost triple the percentage of GDP devoted to research and development over the next 5 years. Now, it's from a small number to a still somewhat modest number, but they're certainly doing that. If you look at the numbers of citations in world-class journals, they're going up. The percentage of articles written by Chinese in China that are deemed worthy of citation in international journals. Now it's starting from a low number and going up to a still modest number, but the Chinese graph is going this way, and the U.S. is a bit of a sinking, although very much higher in absolute percentage than China or indeed anybody else. Same with numbers of patents. Low number, but compounding very rapidly. So the point isn't China's going to overtake us in innovation tomorrow or 5 years, but you begin to think 10, 15, and 20 years out on anything like these trends, and I think the Chinese are moving ahead. What also struck me in this category of minds is a kind of a catch-all category, to be honest. I looked at the quality of Chinese leaders, in particular diplomats. Just give you an example that's sort of emblematic. Chinese diplomats all over the world have, for the most part, remarkable training. I mentioned in the book the current ambassador to the United States, Zhou Wenjun. He alternated in his career between posts in the United States for a long time, back to China. He was posted in San Francisco, Los Angeles. He was deputy of the mission in Washington, had another posting at the mission in Washington, then became ambassador. 5 different posts in at least 3 different parts of the United States, and always. He had also been just in the interim ambassador in Australia. So, but this isn't an unusual case. You look at the quality of training that Chinese diplomats or county magistrates or mayors. The mayor of Shanghai, Xu Guangdi, had been an intern at Ericsson in Sweden. I mean, you just begin to look at the details of the biographies of people moving up. I think you've got to be pretty impressed with the caliber and systematic nature of the training of Chinese leaders. Now, I'm not endorsing all their human rights policies and all of the things that one could be much more skeptical about, but I'm saying we are up against high-quality leaders. Certainly in a technical sense, they know what's going on. Now, I have a chapter in there after all this. I think the bottom line is that one has to be pretty impressed with the degree to which the Chinese have moved forward in all three dimensions. They've kept military in a subordinate but nonetheless moving forward a dimension. They're putting the emphasis on intellect and economy, which is going to give them a basis to move ahead further militarily and in every other way they wish in the future. So, having said all of this, what are some of the conclusions? I think the first thing is don't underestimate what the Chinese aspiration is. And I'm not trying to create a threat. I'm not actually particularly worried if we make appropriate responses ourselves, but China wants to be a comprehensive global power. None of this regional power, none of this totally self-absorbed. China wants to be a comprehensive national power, and that means to my thinking, balanced portfolio of economic, intellectual, and military power exerted on a global basis. I didn't really start with that as a presumption. I may be wrong, but I think it's as clear as it can be. The Chinese do not have a modest ambition. And that's why I started out by saying we've got to get used to rubbing elbows with other people that don't see themselves in an entirely subordinate position, if indeed they ever did. So I think, look at the Chinese ambition. Secondly, I was at a meeting where Secretary Kissinger was. I don't know if were you at that National Committee board meeting where Secretary Kissinger was, Mary? And as I recall, at Secretary Kissinger, somebody mentioned Deng Xiaoping, and he leaned over and said, the more I hear about Deng Xiaoping, the smarter that guy was. Well, I think that sort of captured it. And I tried to define, what was Deng's vision? And I think if we appreciate the scope of it, we'll sort of understand the Chinese strategy. And I think Deng had a strategy that had three objectives. One is China has to globalize. China has been a huge beneficiary of globalization and is one of the big supporters of globalization, even in its current moment of let us say, stress and difficulty. He was the exact opposite of Mao. Mao believed in autarky, self-sufficiency, zili gengsheng. Well, certainly Deng didn't. Secondly, Deng believed in urbanization. Mao had some kind of appreciation / fascination with the peasantry. I think it's fair to say Deng never believed China could be a great country and remain a peasant country, and ultimately was going to have to urbanize, and what the rate of urbanization that's occurred is absolutely staggering. In the last 30 years, China's moved 300 million people into the cities, population the size roughly of the United States, and it still has 400 million to go. So they're only, not even halfway on the urbanization continuum. But he believed in a globally integrated China and a urbanized China. And the final thing is he believed in marketization. I had a memorable lunch with Deng Xiaoping's youngest daughter once. And I asked her why she why her father always wanted rapid economic growth and believed so much in market economy. She said, well, my father really asked the following question: why are Chinese poor why are Chinese rich everywhere but China? Not a bad question in 1978. And he noted that Taiwan and Singapore and Hong Kong and Korea, what were, in the traditional Chinese thinking, the periphery, why were they all at per capita incomes, above $10,000, and China at that point's at 300 or lower? What's going on? And so he dedicated himself to unleashing what had made Chinese so successful everywhere but China. Market. So here's a guy, if you ask what the core of the strategy is, it's globalization, marketization, and urbanization. And that's really where this system has been moving with such great success. But you can understand why the Chinese are now worried with the current downturn, because it threatens their access to this market. abroad, access to capital, access to technology, so on. Chinese very worried about protectionism, as they would see it, protectionist tendencies in the rest of the world. So if you're going to have this kind of strategy of enormous domestic change, then what kind of foreign policy do you need? And this is, I think, the third part of his strategy, and that is that you have to create a cocoon. You have to, in fact, have a placid external environment that doesn't force you to spend a lot of money on the military and maintain open, and you receive investment, technology, and access to markets to make the strategy work. And China's essentially had a foreign policy of make friends with everybody you can. Now, obviously, the Chinese don't always do things that make friends everywhere, but I think the impulse is to minimize external difficulty to maximize external, so you can focus internally, minimize external problems. Well, what are some of the implications for U.S., and I'll just end in 2 minutes here so we have questions. I would say, I think one of the big dangers we face is making China a military problem when it's primarily an intellectual and economic challenge. And that leads to my final conclusion, which is really reform in China requires reform in America. That we've got to become more competitive. You start looking at infrastructure in China, and I just last month driving on highways in China, it's really impressive. Not only the number, but in general, not always, the quality of the highways infrastructure, ports, telecommunication system. You look at the university system, it may be growing so rapidly quality control is a problem, but they've quadrupled higher educational enrollment since 1995. They've got a much greater percentage of the population in secondary school. If you look at R&D development, I mentioned they're boosting their development resources there. In short, I think China, and probably we ought to put India to some extent in this same picture, is becoming more and more competitive. And as they move up that value-added chain, we're going to have to move up. Our kids, our grandkids are going to have to keep moving up that ladder. And I think that means that we've got to get healthcare costs down from, what, 17% of GDP or 16, 17%. How we do it, it's easy to say, hard to do. We've got to get our kids performing better in schools. We've got to do a lot of things infrastructure-wise to become more competitive. And the final thing is that, and I'll end where I began, the United States, one of the toolboxes we've liked to use is sanctions. I don't think sanctions are generally going to be so successful with China precisely now because many of the people that we need to cooperate with us to impose sanctions are not going to be willing to do so. And so we are going to have intrinsically attractive ideas, appeal to the interests of others, but we're not going to be able to, in effect, use coercive means to win compliance, even among our allies. And I think you can see this just in the North Korean problem. The United States really hasn't had the kind of cooperation it wants, even from the Republic of Korea. We get off and on cooperation from the Japanese. Everybody has their interests in China. They don't always accord with us. And we're going to have to compromise and negotiate rather than dictate. If we ever dictated in the past, those days are long gone. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. I should have said something to outrage somebody here. Yes, Cliff.
You have not commented really on Taiwan. I guess foreign policy really isn't the thrust here, but if you put it in the conceptual framework of your three legs, so to speak, if you think about the application of power and how, would you mind commenting or setting the stage for us and how you look at Taiwan today and maybe for the next 5 or 10 years, since it has been, if you will, a client state of the U.S. I don't know if that still works today or not, but I think we could say that when I served in the Navy there, it certainly was 2 years ago. I'd like to hear your
Well, I'll just give you my personal thoughts, and I think those thoughts really are, well, let me put it this way. I think the Chinese believe time is working in their favor, that if they can just prevent Taiwan from going independent, which I think they're becoming increasingly confident that they can do, that in fact Taiwan will gradually find it its economic interests and connections and cultural and intermarriage and so forth across the straits, all of this knitting together, eventually somehow in some way will move towards something that ultimately could be called reunification, although I don't think anybody knows exactly what that would mean in a very concrete form. The core point being is I think the Chinese have become progressively more confident that things are moving their way, so that if they can just avoid Taiwan becoming detached in some de jure way in the short run, the long run will work to their advantage. And frankly, I think the dominant thought in Taiwan, not the dominant wish, the dominant analysis in Taiwan is the same. They're worried about that. And in fact, one of the big debates is how much PRC investment should we allow in Taiwan? I mean, if the PRC can take some of its $2 trillion in foreign exchange and start buying banks, utilities, I mean, you know, what is the implication? I mean, 23 million, I mean, that's a small province in China. I think, in a sense, the underlying fear of Taiwan is that events are also moving in their direction, and there's a debate. Now, you had Mr. Chen Shui-bian was the former president in Taiwan. I think his strategy to deal with this is try to build up identity of Taiwan people in Taiwan, try to find outside relationships. I think in his own, as it turned out to be, awkward way, he tried to get a bigger defense commitment, in a sense, out of the United States. But the U.S. was reluctant to be dragged further into this. And the long and the short of it is, the way I would see it is China's power is going this way. Taiwan's power, just by virtue of its size, it can't go, there's going to become a bigger and bigger gap between the strategic importance to the U.S. of Taiwan and Taiwan. Whatever you think the situation is now, they're divergent. And over time, what Taiwan's effect asking us is, you guarantee our security, even though over time the cost to you, the Americans, of doing so is going to become greater and greater, and your foregone interests with the PRC, which is becoming more and more important. So I think, you know, from a strategic point, the U.S. is going to be asked to pay a bigger and bigger price to protect smaller and smaller interests. And I mean, I'm not advocating that, I'm not reveling in that, I can worry about that, but that seems to me the reality. And if you look at public opinion polls, you know, well, first of all, about 85 to 95% of Americans don't know the difference between the PRC and the ROC, so there's a lot of ignorance here. But polls have shown time and again that around 2/3 of the Americans don't want to get sucked into a fight in the Taiwan Straits when the issue is explained to them. So I'm not saying the U.S. is going to, you know, abandon its commitments. But all I'm saying is I think the PRC is fairly confident that history is moving in its direction, that Taiwan is worried there, and that the objective structure of interests between the United States and China versus Taiwan, combined with our reluctance to get involved there, means that I think, you know, both you have your situation now where Hu Jintao and Ma Ying-jeou, the new president, have proposed a peace agreement. Now, there's a lot of distance to be covered between these general proposals and what could ever happen. But I wouldn't be surprised in the next period of time, and I don't know if I mean a decade or 5 years or conceivably 20, but I think you'll probably see, you know, some kind of desire just to freeze the status quo in military terms, trading, you know, a no attack pledge from the PRC and no declaration of independence on Taiwan. And, you know, personal opinion, I think the U.S. can live with that. Don't think it might be favorable to our interests. Yes, sir.
Earlier this year, Robert Kaplan wrote in Foreign Affairs an essay on the increasing importance of the Indian Ocean.
Right, I saw that.
You read it?
Yes, but you're going to remind me what it said.
I was just talking a little bit about how recent events and historical implications of the Indian Ocean have helped propel, or not propel, but are going to become the major kind of center for international focus in the region in the years to come. And I wanted to ask you about the, I guess China's supply chain a little bit is affected by its neighbors. It's becoming an increasing buyer of goods from its neighbors, as you said in your presentation. How will the events in the region, we're talking about increasing piracy in the Gulf of Aden, increasing instability in Afghanistan, civil war in Sri Lanka, how are all these how is the projection of these events going to either hinder China's growth economically and as a power in the region, or how will it boost its power in the region?
Yeah.
Because it will become a more predominant player in these.
Yeah. Well, you've got a lot of pieces out there, but it elicits, I think, some interesting observations. I think, if my fundamental proposition is China aspires to be a global comprehensive power, that means China will develop through globalization and the global supply chain and so on, interests further and further from its shores and become more interdependent with the world, whether it's energy, resources of various sorts, and so forth. So I see a China that's becoming more economically interdependent, and it's going to grow its military to protect the sea lanes, for one thing, and you see a great emphasis in Chinese military strategy of moving away from land forces towards sea and air forces, and if you have a navy, you want an air force that can provide air cover. So you can see the Chinese moving in that direction, and China has just recently, and I think it was in 2002 or 4, I can't remember which, made the decision to go after apparently 2 aircraft carriers. Now it's a huge undertaking not to just build the ship, but you need a large number of ships to protect it. So I think you could say one of the implications of all this is that China is going to build a military that has global reach. It's going to take 20, 30 years, and we won't be standing still, but you're going to see Chinese ships further and further. Exhibit A is the Gulf of Aden off Somalia. That got Chinese ship there. Now, I'm unaware that they've actually done anything. They're really nervous about getting involved, and they're not like the Bainbridge, kind of out there. But I think that's just a straw in the wind. That's one thing. Secondly, China is, I think energy is a good area to look at. China is just, it's now over 50% of its petroleum needs are import, and they'll be up to 75%. It depends on what you assume about economic growth and everything. But probably by 2020, 2025, it's going to be at 75%, which is a degree of dependency as greater than the United States on oil imports. So China's extremely worried about that. And what it's doing is, besides building a navy to protect oil as it flows through Straits of Malacca and that region, is that it's trying to build overland pipelines from Kazakhstan. They've even invested, you hear various figures, 75 billion to 100 billion in natural gas fields in Iran. Been some talk about pipelines there. Pipeline into Burma. So that ships could come in on the Burma side, not have to go through the Straits of Malacca, over land, doing a lot to diversify their sources of supply, so they don't have to depend on just one vulnerable set of sea lanes and so forth. So you see the Chinese really, as their interests and their reliance on the international community for certainly resources is leading to diversification and increasing military capability and so on. And it's all, I think, perfectly predictable. And so, as China's naval power grows, then the question's going to be, how does the U.S. and indeed how does India, in the case of those waters, react? And we're going to have to, negotiate out rules of the road and so forth. But I don't think this is all destined to be just a replay of the growth of the Japanese Imperial Navy and end up with the same sad story. I mean, I think there are other outcomes beyond conflict. And indeed, we might in the future find ourselves cooperating with the Chinese in case of pirates in the Aden Sea and so forth. So I don't think this is destined to conflict, but we have to realize candidly what's going on and then, develop arrangements to deal with it. But the option of stopping China doesn't exist, I don't believe. The question is, are we going to deal with it in a constructive way or not? Did I see a hand there, or was that? I thought I did. Yes, sir.
You alluded to the Korea situation.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it to China's interest to see that there are no nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula?
Uh-huh.
You mentioned that China, two things, that they'd like to use power other than military power. Doesn't the economic dependence of North Korea on China, especially in the for energy, give China a great deal of power? And you talked about making friends with a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't China taking a more active role to see that at least that North Korea returns again to the six-party talks, or does follow through with its agreement to denuclearize? Wouldn't that satisfy a lot of the Chinese goals?
Mm-hmm.
Why have they not been more, at least high profile?
Yeah.
Not active? We don't
Good.
know, I guess, everything.
Yeah, good questions. I'll start with the first, or start towards the end. Why haven't the Chinese done more was one question. You got a whole series there. I would just say I don't know that we know all of what China has or hasn't done. So let's put it this way: there's a black box here, and what's gone on inside it, not only with the North Koreans, but what have the Chinese done or not done? Let's say we have less than 100% certainty here. So they may have done more than we think. What we can say is it hasn't been effective for the most part. A couple of things we can say the Chinese have done. It went back, if I have my year correct, 2003. We were talking. We had there's been the two-party and three-party talks, and then became the six-party talks, and it gets very complicated. But at one moment, when the issue was would it become the six-party talks, China churned off energy and said it had a technical difficulty with the pipeline, and that seemed to have some bearing with the Koreans becoming more flexible there. And that's the kind of thing you're talking about. There may have been other instances where the Chinese reduced food shipments or other energy shipments that we don't know about. But I think what you can say is the North Koreans on a couple of occasions have slapped the Chinese in the face irrespective of what they think the Chinese could do. And a good example would be the nuclear test in 2006. The Chinese made it clear they didn't want that to happen. The Chinese also made it clear they didn't want this latest rocket test. So, I've had the Chinese, put it this way, with friends like the North Koreans, who needs enemies? There's a high... Right. So now the question is, there is this dependence for food and energy on the North Koreans. Why don't the Chinese put more pressure on them? I believe the answer to that is two things. One is I don't think that the Chinese really want necessarily, they don't want to see the collapse of the North Korean regime, not only because of refugees, but that's true, because the Northeast is a high unemployment, has got a lot of social problems already there, and they don't want more to deal with. I think that's true. But I think there's a thing they wouldn't say, but in fact may be as important. And that is, I don't think China really wants a united Korea. And if North Korea implodes, I think the Chinese think the odds are the South Koreans will become the inheritors of the peninsula, as the West Germans did with the collapse of East Germany. And frankly, I think the Chinese would prefer a divided Korean peninsula in which they have a weak buffer state that in some sense is reliant on them, as opposed to a united Korea that over time might be an economic competitor, might be a base for outside powers, Japan or the United States. So, the formal Chinese policy is we favor a united Korea as the Koreans themselves would choose. But in fact, I don't think that's necessarily true. So as painful as it is to deal with the obstreperous North Koreans, that doesn't mean they therefore prefer some result that might produce a united Korean peninsula, which they would have less influence on up against their border. So I think that combined with the refugee sets of concerns is key. I would say one other thing, and that is I don't think that the Chinese are as worried about North Korea having nuclear weapons as we are. I mean, I've had many Chinese say, they're not going to attack us. We'd prefer not to have it because it breaks down the proliferation regime, and then you got Iran, and then you got Syria, and then the world gets progressively, and then maybe the Japanese begin to think about things. And what about Taiwan? And so forth. So they would clearly prefer not the proliferation. That's a clear preference. I think they're genuine on that. But I don't think they're as afraid of weapons per se in the hands of the North Koreans as, say, we. Well, actually, the South Koreans have a complicated view on this, but certainly the Japanese, and so forth. So that's the best explanation I can come up with, a combination of fear of refugees, a desire to keep a kind of somewhat weak buffer state between you and the unknown. And they're not quite as worried about proliferation as we are. It's my understanding. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I really liked it.
Thank you.
My question is on China's minds. As you might have noticed, leaders of China have recently been focusing on building the country's soft power in a way that Joseph and I might disagree, because they're trying to, instead of trying to build a strong society and to make better movies for that sake, they're actually trying to use the government-controlled media outlets like Xinhua Publishing to sort of promote the country's image to the world. Do you think that strategy might actually work, or it's just going to be perceived by the rest of the world as a propaganda by the Chinese government?
Well, I suppose it depends if the whole thing is government managed, and obviously so, that would strike me as maybe going to be a little less effective. But let me just ask you a question. We will say the Olympic Games was government managed in a sense, right? But what would you say was the net impact on China's image in the world? What do you think? I think it was a net plus. We could argue about how and how you measure it and so forth, but I think it was a big net plus. And that was a pretty government-managed operation. And the systematic nature with which they went on that, what did they get awarded in 2002 or whatever it was really quite, and I'm not endorsing all the things they did to get to that point, but my sense is that was a big net plus for them. Now, I don't know if it was worth $40 billion, which I understand is the rough price tag. We could debate, was it worth $40 billion? I don't even know how you'd begin to answer that question. But I think, I wouldn't say just because the Chinese government plays a major role, it's destined to be ineffective. I guess I wouldn't say that, which I think was sort of the implication there. But the point is that China has a lot of sources of initiative and soft power, if you want to put it in that broad term. I don't use that term really in my book. But, I mean, I know what you mean. There's nothing wrong with the term. But there are lots of sources of initiative that give China soft power that really aren't necessarily intrinsically government. Just to give you an example, I went to the Taoist monasteries and national park on the Han River up at Danjiangkou called Wudangshan. Phenomenal. I mean, this is a world-class site in the United Nations, with the World Heritage Site. I mean, this is really attractive. You had people from Japan, all over Asia, and so forth. And the government's played a role, but international organizations have helped and so forth. You said that China isn't doing movies, but of course China is doing movies, and occasionally joint ventures, often, sometimes with Taiwan, sometimes with firms, Hong Kong firms, American firms. They're moving in that direction. So I don't want to exaggerate it, and I think they've got a long way to go. In the book, actually, there's an outfit that does looks at global box office and what percentage of tickets purchased for entry into movies are in different countries. Well, China's moving up from real low. I mean, Hollywood's way up there, and Bollywood and so forth. So I don't mean, but China sees this, and there's an interesting thing going on in the publishing industry too. If you look at the range of what's being published in China and for foreign audiences, I spent a lot of time looking at the development of the Great Wall foreign broadcast cable services of China and the number of households around the world that are tuned in. There is a virtual community of the Chinese diaspora all over the world that listens to Chinese TV in real time. And my assistant from Shanghai is one of them. She gets it's Chinese news from China. And the Chinese are spending, you look at what they're doing with their satellite system, and I talk about their space program and so on. A lot of this is with global communications, and I met with Jiang Zemin once, and he says, you Americans, you always say everybody's equal. Well, that's not true, because you with things like CNN, you control the global media dialogue, and we're going to break that monopoly. And you can go right to the State Council website, look at their space plan, and then you can start seeing what the communication satellites, television transmission, and so on. This is what I mean. I think the Chinese are thinking what they're doing. And, you know, they're starting from low numbers, but there's positive incline on and it won't be very long till it's significant. We're all going to see it. You know, it wasn't very long ago that we weren't talking about Chinese cars, and now we're talking about Chinese cars. Yeah.
I very much enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. Question for you: PetroChina, some major petroleum corporations are really bankrolling the Sudanese government's activities and the situation in Darfur. You're well aware of that. I mean, it seems so antithetical to. I mean, I realize that they want to get the petroleum control because of their needs, and they are making a lot of initiatives throughout Africa.
Right.
Presidential housing, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
How do you see means of influencing by the world community to say, okay, you can have access, but for goodness sakes.
You mean don't start a race to the bottom here on standards of human rights?
Yes.
Right. I'm certainly not going to endorse everything the Chinese have done, and in Darfur is a problem, and we could add export of weapons to Zimbabwe, and there are some other things out there. So I'm at least aware of a broad range of things that we might disapprove of in terms of China and its behavior. All I would say is that the Chinese seem to be becoming more sensitive to this. And so, for instance, they created a special envoy who on several occasions has talked to Bashir and Hu Jintao, I believe, and I can't remember Wen Jiabao as well. But anyway, Chinese leaders have gone to Sudan, partly maybe major league for oil-related interests, but have also urged him to cooperate with the Organization of African Unity and the UN forces. China has agreed and has, I forget, don't hold me to the numbers, I want to say 350, something in that order, peacekeepers. Often they're support people, not rifle carriers, but has committed to the OAU UN mission in Sudan, and I think has tried to use its diplomatic offices to reduce the problem within the framework of keeping access to the oil. I don't think they're willing to jeopardize their energy interests for this. But I think you have to ask a little bit, in all candor, what's the rest of the world actually done? Really? I mean, I'm not trying to clean the Chinese with everybody else's dirty water here, but I mean, it is at least worthwhile to ask what have others actually done. So I think the Chinese are sensitive to appear that they will do anything for oil. And therefore, I think they're beginning to try to take steps that at least create the appearance of being sensitive. As far as I can see, it's been ineffective, almost in the same way as the North Korean situation. On the other hand, what influence has anybody had on these people? Bashir, in this case. So I'm not, making a moral endorsement here. It just seems to me nobody's found a way to be effective. But this is the problem China faces as it becomes its capacities for influence increase. Every time we've got an issue with somebody in a place we perceive them to have influence, we expect them to use it to our ends. And now maybe it's their ends, maybe it isn't their ends. But this is going to be one of the problems in U.S.-China relations, because as China gets more capacity, we're going to expect them to use it. And thank you very much, we're going to expect them to use it in the ways we want and we value. And sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. And I think the Chinese think they have less capacity than them. I'm not saying they're right, but I think it's a tragic situation. The Chinese seem to have a better vocabulary and better actions, but to no discernible benefit of the people of Darfur would be my feeling. Yes?
I also have a question about the mines. As we know, there's a huge Chinese presence in the economic field in the USA. I'm just wondering how much of that is perceived as a threat, because I know it's very difficult for students to get a visa, F1 visa, into the United States. And when they graduate, with the recent increased regulations about the H1B visa, it's also very tough to get a job. So, just how much of a threat does the U.S. in general perceive the China intellects in the U.S. With regards to economics and the job market?
You know, I think you can kind of see threats wherever you want to. I mean, you could construct a threat picture of people staying and being in our labs and so forth and transferring technology back to China, if you want to look at it that way. Most of the academics I know are, you can look at universities as looking for the best brains in the world to participate in our research projects, foster innovation. I think that's the dominant view. But on the other hand, there are people who worry about federal regulations that were being debated about the access of foreign nationals to sensitive labs with export-controlled equipment in it. In fact, I know Hopkins, among where I teach, was apoplectic about the idea that foreign students couldn't be in the labs with export-controlled. You just well, you know, substantially impair all your research projects. So, on the other hand, if you want to be worried about something, Chinese students that get all this knowledge go back, and then they increase China's competitiveness. So it seems to me you can look in any direction and find a problem. I tend to think America's historic strength has been attracting the brightest minds to contribute to our projects, and we keep 3 steps ahead of everybody else, and if foreign nationals want to help us, that's so much the better for us. I think, you know, the defensive game loses, the offensive game wins. So I take our attractiveness to. I was quite struck by Thomas Friedman. I often like what he has to say, but he says, you know, I commented on the Hopkins graduation and nanotechnology and all this. We ought to be giving, you know, pathways to citizenship right along with a degree. You graduate, you get. I mean, I think that's worth thinking about. So anyway, I think you can see threats in any number of directions, you know, people will continue to do so. But I think on balance, it's been terrific for us. But does that answer your or address your question? Yeah. Yes.
My question is more about China's relationships with Latin American countries.
Oh.
Because they're so driven by resources and energy and anything natural, they're increasingly forming relationships in our backyard, and how does that impact positively or negatively, even neutralize our policy towards China and towards, in general, the BRIC countries?
Yeah, good question. And in fact, I'd say the U.S. Senate's had hearings on this question, and of course it raises more mundane questions perhaps about China is the number 2 user in the Panama Canal. China has leases to port facilities on both ends. So Latin America is actually a sensitive thing in Congress, and particularly the Senate, particularly when Jesse Helms was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, had regular hearings on this. But and one of my colleagues, a man named Reardon Ruret, just put out a book with a co-author, as he entitled it, somewhat to my chagrin, called I think it was The Chinese Invasion of Latin America. Was the whole book was actually the antithetical. It wasn't an invasion, but anyway, that was the title. So there's lots of interest in this topic. I think most of the research done on this shows that the impact of China on Latin America depends on which Latin American country we're talking about. If you take Mexico, it's really been tough with the light industrial maquiladora sort of trade there, where China is the low-cost producer, and unemployment among Mexican workers in competitive industries has really been hit. But other countries like Brazil and Argentina take soybeans, iron ore, timber, have been, well, when the drive up in commodity prices, big winners. Now, when I say big winners, I mean in those industries. But China, for instance, has become a major furniture maker. And China doesn't have much wood. So much of it's coming, some of it, much of it, I don't know what I mean by much, a significant fraction, from illegal logging, not only in the Amazon, but also in Indonesia, the Malay Peninsula, and so forth. So, you know, when you talk about winners and losers, it's pretty complicated. Now, Hu Jintao went to Latin America, as I recall, in 2002, and at least was reported, the Chinese subsequently sort of denied, promised as I recall, $100 billion in investment in Latin America over the next 10 years. That has not happened. And there's a lot of disappointment in Latin America that the Chinese seem more interested in the commodities than in the long-term investment and so forth. But I think you'd probably have to say net, countries like Argentina and Brazil have benefited, and countries like Mexico don't think they've benefited. And so it's kind of mixed. And the other thing is it's not an economic consideration, it's Taiwan. Still, Latin America has I forget what the latest count is, but a few countries that recognize Taiwan. And so there's and particularly when you add in the Caribbean to that area. So there's a competition there between Taiwan and the People's Republic for recognition, although right now they have a ceasefire on this, but I'm not sure how long that'll last. But complicated question. Yeah.
I think we really are at our time point.
Okay.
So maybe if you want to condense the last couple of questions and answer quickly.
Okay.
So I'll let you talk informally in the reception, or we could just move to the reception now,
whatever you want.
Our speaker.
Why don't we get the two quick questions? I'll take once, and then we can get to the session.
Don't the Chinese already have a huge advantage by holding so much U.S. debt, and won't they have it for a long time because it's so much?
Yeah. Okay, so debt. Was there one other question? Yeah.
Yeah. I had a question about how afraid should China be about U.S. protectionism? You said that the Chinese were really concerned about protectionism. And second question, do you know if your book is being made in China or the U.S.?
Yes. Well, it was made in the U.S. and is continued, but in China they just published it in the Chinese edition. They bought the rights from the University of California Press, did it the legal way. You will be interested. I reserved the right. I said I didn't really care about the economic angle, but what I wanted was a full and faithful translation. And I wanted a review of the Chinese translation before publication. And they sent me text changes underlined in red and blue wherever there was a change and or a deletion. And I had the right to comment on every one of them. I didn't agree with a few. I was surprised how few I did have to disagree with. And they changed them. I don't want to draw any cosmic conclusions, but I never thought I'd live to see a China that sent me text changes and clearly identified where I might be concerned and ask my opinion and pay for the rights. I never thought I'd see that day. And on the debt, yes, the United States, I think the way to put it is President Obama's stimulus plan and deficit spending requires China and Japan and Korea to continuing to buy U.S. debt at a very high level. China's the biggest holder of U.S. Treasury debt and agency debt, and as the Minister of Finance told me once, we don't actually know how much of your debt we have because we also own municipal and state debt and corporate debt and so forth. So they have a lot of our debt, and they are feeling, I think, that we are pumping so many dollars into the system that we're going to move from an insufficient demand situation to an inflationary situation, and the holdings of all their there's again a debate out of their $2 trillion in foreign exchange. we usually think there's about 66% held and denominated in dollars. So let's just say you're talking about 1.6 trillion holding of US dollars in debt instruments. If we inflate, we're reducing the value of all of those dollars the Chinese hold. And so they are very concerned about the fiscal responsibility. And as I was telling Mary, just to end this up, I took my students to the Bank of China, and we got a lecture from the number 2 in the Bank of China about fiscal responsibility. I mean, this sounded like the Republican National Committee. So, thank you very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.